Thank you again, everyone, for joining, whether it's morning, afternoon, evening, nighttime. We are so excited that you're here today to join us for the fifth webinar in our BE.Hour webinar series, exploring a variety of behavioral concepts. And today we are focusing specifically on exploring RARE's levers of behavior change, which is a super fun topic. And I think we're going to have a really great conversation. Next slide, please. So last time, just to recap very quickly, and I will drop a link in the chat for our last webinar, but last time we had a really good conversation with two of my colleagues at RARE. First, Fiona Rogerson. Fiona reviewed the basics of creating hypotheses and also theories of change and differentiated the two. Fiona discussed why having a hypothesis is so critical in a behavioral intervention journey, and also the steps, the high-level steps of how to create hypotheses and theories of change. And then my colleague Rahim reviewed how RARE has used hypotheses in our own projects, specifically in a recent project in behavioral science and policy, and focused on the hypotheses surrounding decreasing meat consumption, which was a really interesting topic. After those two presentations, we had a really fun group discussion in two different rooms. So Fiona had a breakout room to kind of review the basics of hypotheses. Rahim had a breakout room to discuss how RARE has used hypotheses, and it was a really great conversation. And so I highly encourage you to watch that webinar and the previous webinars that we've had. Again, I'll drop a link in the chat for that. So this time, we have two wonderful speakers. We'll have first up my colleague Katie Williamson, who will introduce herself in her presentation, who works for RARE's B Center, which is the Center for Behavior in the Environment, shortened to B Center. Katie is based in the Washington, D.C. area of the United States. And next up, we'll have Michelle Metzler, who is joining us from the Recycling Partnership, or TRP, you'll see it shortened, who is joining us this morning very early from Bellingham, Washington, also in the United States. And again, I'll let them both introduce themselves in their respective presentations. Just a few objectives for today. First of all, we're going to identify, or Katie is going to help us identify the 6 levers of behavior change. We'll talk about the key principles of each lever, and Katie will provide some real-world examples. Then we'll hear an example from Michelle of TRP and how TRP has used a combination of levers in their own work. We'll then go into breakout rooms. We'll have one breakout room for Katie, where Katie will talk about the 6 levers, answer any questions that you may have about RARE's 6 levers. Michelle will also have a breakout room, and that will be to get more information about how TRP has used levers in their own work. And then finally, we'll close out and we'll provide some links about where to find resources on those levers. And then before we get into it, just a couple reminders and a couple announcements for those who haven't heard of it. First of all, on June 11th in Washington, D.C., the B Center and RARE is hosting BE.Hive, which is a one-day summit that explores behavioral insights and how they've been applied to achieve environmental impacts. It is going to be a wonderful event. It's going to be a fun event, an engaging event. I will put the link in the chat as well for BE.Hive. If you are in the area and are interested in registering, it's going to be something else. And we have a variety of really cool speakers who will be joining us. So definitely something to look out for if you are in the DC area. I also would like to remind folks that these webinars are really for building community in our behavior.rare.org community. So behavior.rare.org is the B Center's website where you can find a variety of resources, case studies, videos, and other tools to use behavioral science in your own work. And so again, we encourage everyone to have an account on behavior.rare.org. It is a free account. I think the majority of you already have one, but I will also put in the chat a link to register if you have not registered for the B Center. So with that, I will turn it over to wonderful Katie. And Katie, you can take it away and tell us about the levers of behavioral science.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Maria. And hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this webinar. So as Maria mentioned, in our last few webinars, we have explored some of the earlier steps of behavior-centered design. So identifying your actors and behaviors within your challenge, gathering some research data and insights on those behaviors, And then last time we talked about developing a hypothesis for your behavior change challenge. And so today we're really focused on what we call the ideate step, which is brainstorming solutions. And to provide some inspiration for that, we are going to be talking about the levers of behavior change as a way of providing this toolkit of strategies that you can use in your behavior change work. So the levers of behavior change, just some terminology here. So when we're talking about a lever, it's typically something that you pull to cause a change in something else. You might think of like a machine using those different levers. And then also wanted to call out a leverage point. Which is a place in a system where there's an opportunity for change or influence. So we're using levers here as those different opportunities to make change. And you'll see the 6 levers that we use at Rare on the screen here, and I'm going to go over what those are, as well as give you some examples before turning it over to Michelle to give you that real-world example from the Recycling Partnership. So before I go into the levers, just a little bit of background on behavioral science and decision making. So as humans, we have this spectrum of effortful and automatic ways of thinking and deciding. So some of our decisions we make with a lot of consideration, weighing different options, calculating those costs and benefits. And then there are other decisions that we make more automatically, quickly, even feeling subconsciously. And so there's this whole range of decision making, and we want to make sure that when we're looking at our behavior change challenges, that we're accounting for where these different decisions fall along that spectrum. Oftentimes, we like to assume that people are putting a lot of thought and effort into all of their decision making. And we sometimes ignore some of those quicker decisions that people are making and how our solutions might account for those. So when we're appealing to that particular way of thinking that's more effortful, some folks talk about it as more rational forms of thinking. We tend to rely on these 3 levers for behavior change, which are offering information, building awareness, creating incentives or removing barriers, and also enacting legislation through rules and regulations. This is just a brief overview of these. I imagine these may be more familiar, or at least a little familiar to some of you, as strategies that you may have used in your work. And so when we talk about material incentives, we're talking about increasing or decreasing the real or perceived costs, time, or effort for doing a behavior. So this could be through making something easier, giving rewards or penalties. For rules and regulations, this is the ways that we are mandating or prohibiting certain behaviors. And then for information, this is where we are providing information about what the behavior is, why it's important, and how to do it. So we have different informational needs beyond just the what of behavior. And so we can provide instructions, we can build self-efficacy, or this concept of the confidence that I have the skills and tools to do something. And we can also build awareness and understanding around unfamiliar challenges. So these are a component of many behavior change solutions. And we encourage you to use these in combination with each other, as well as some of the other levers that I'll share in a moment. And we say that in particular because we've found that these levers tend not to work on their own. So I wanted to share just a few notes about things to look out for when using these few levers. So with material incentives, when we're focused on those costs and benefits of behavior, being mindful of where those incentives may work against our objectives. They may, what we call, crowd out other motivators, which means that there are times when providing an incentive for something may reduce someone's internal interest in doing a behavior. If you have a particular program budget, relying on incentives can drain those resources. And for individuals who have a lot of wealth or resources, those putting on a fine can be seen as the cost for behavior, just the cost. So thinking about where those incentives can be useful, and as we'll discuss later, in combination with some of these other behaviors. We also have rules and regulations. So rules tend to work best with enforcement. So maybe paired with that material incentive. So creating that consequence of breaking the rule. And also if the related social norms or local context are not aligned with those rules. So something to look out for in the places that you're working. And then finally, for information, trying to challenge our assumptions about where information is really necessary or a prerequisite for change. As there are times where there are information gaps, particularly for new behaviors that we want to introduce. But sometimes we rely really heavily on information. And another place where we can combine this with a couple of the other levers that I'll share in a moment. So part of this webinar is to encourage you to think about all of the different solutions that you have in your toolkit and strategies in your toolkit that accommodate our full spectrum of decision making. So this includes thinking about emotional appeals. So the ways that emotions are driving our decision making, the way that we live as a social species, so those social influences. And then also choice architecture, and that may be a new term for some of you, which is the context of our decision making. So those small cues in our environment that are giving us a nudge or a clue as to a particular behavior. So now I'm going to share a bit more about strategies related to those, and then give you a real-world example of each as well. So for emotional appeals, these are the different ways that we're relying on our interests, what's important to us, our values, and emotions to drive behavior. So thinking about different emotions in different contexts, personalizing and tailoring the message. Our team at Rare has done some research on identifying specific emotions for different conservation challenges. So we encourage you to check that out as well. So one example here, this is from some of our work in Brazil and our fisheries program on sustainable fishing. And something that we like to do in our work is create community gatherings, create really positive experiences when we are supporting our campaign managers in introducing these different behaviors as a way to get people interested, talking to each other, excited about species conservation. We often use the local language in that place, local species. We work really closely with community members to build events that are really accommodating the local context and interests. And so all of this is a way of building that emotion, sense of joy and pride around particular behaviors. And so an example of where can we draw on those emotions to drive behavior. For social influences, so this is where we're leveraging the behavior, beliefs, and expectations of others. So we can do this in a few different ways, such as making a behavior more observable, highlighting others that are doing the target behavior, and also sharing our social expectations about the target behavior. And to give a bit more science behind social influences, is we can break this down into two types of influence. So there is what we call reputational influence, which is what do people think of my actions? How do I think people are looking at me and what I'm doing? And also a more descriptive or normative influence. So what do I think of other people's actions? What am I seeing other people doing? And how is that a signal for me of what behavior might be appropriate in this context or the right thing to do? So one example where we see different parts of this is from a case in the United States on increasing household solar energy. And so a few researchers have started to talk about household solar energy has this contagious property, which is to say that they were finding that the presence of one solar roof project alone increased the average number of installations within a small radius by nearly 50%. So just seeing your neighbor has a solar panel can change your interest in doing that yourself. Another part of this program is they had what are called solar ambassadors. So they built these champions within their networks, within their communities, who would support those different homeowners to go solar. So that peer support, those trusted people in your environment that you can talk to, and also highlighting others who have already gone on this journey in getting solar. They also worked with local government officials to provide some additional support with this process. So some different ways that we're seeing the ability to really use that social influence to grow this program. And then finally, we have choice architecture. So this is, as I mentioned, those clues in our environment about what to do. So we can do this in a few different ways, which is directing attention, simplifying messages and decisions, using timely moments and prompts, and also really facilitating and supporting people's planning processes. So a couple examples here. So this is from our work in Colombia on regenerative agriculture practices. And one of the resources that our team has created is a soil health card. So recognizing that soil health is comprised of complex properties. So there's a lot of different things to look for to know if your soil is healthy, such as the texture, the amount of organic matter, the smell, what you're seeing in the soil. And so something that they created was a really quick checklist of what to look for so that farmers could easily see whether their soil was healthy or not. So a way to really distill a lot of complex information to help people and also building self-efficacy here, I would say as well, for them to know what good looks like. Another example, and this comes from the Hong Kong University Business School, and they were working with an online food ordering platform, like something where you would order like online delivery. And something that they were working on was the default option for including cutlery, so those plastic utensils you might get with a food order. And they were using something called the default, so which is the option, the pre-selected option for you in a given situation. So they had noticed that the default in this online ordering app was to automatically give customers that cutlery whenever they made an online order. And so they changed the default option to be no cutlery. And also included some green points as a reward for not using that. And they found that there was an over 600% increase in consumers opting out of ordering that cutlery just by changing the default. So just that small cue in your environment of the desired behavior can make a big difference. So we've put together a full list of different strategies across these levers. And so there's a lot of options here to choose from and combine that are at your disposal. And Maria is going to share in the chat where you can explore on our website. And we have a quick guide to these in a few different languages where you can use this as a resource for you as some inspiration for strategies moving forward. So I'm now going to turn it over to Michelle to give you a real-world example of what this looks like in the recycling partnership and how she and her team are using these levers to motivate different recycling behaviors. So I'll turn it over to you, Michelle, to share that with us.
Great, thanks so much. My name is Michelle Metzler, and I work for the Recycling Partnership. And we are a US-based organization that works to improve recycling. And my team and I work directly with communities to help them use data-driven approaches to improve their local recycling programs. So the Recycling Partnership, for those of you who aren't familiar, we work across the recycling system to increase and improve recycling. So people are just one aspect of it, but we're also working with communities, with recycling centers, policymakers, and those who make paper and packaging, which are the companies and manufacturers. So we're working across all of these because really, in order to have change and improve recycling, we can't just focus on individuals' actions. We have to look at the whole system. However, people are obviously a really key part of the system, and it's what I'll be focusing on in my presentation today. So in the US, there's really, really strong support for recycling. So over 80% of Americans think that recycling is important, an important step that they can take to help the environment. But despite these high levels of support, nearly half of residential recyclables are still going to the landfill. And so this is really due to an intention action gap where people say that they want to recycle or they say that recycling is important, but then we're not seeing that follow through when it comes to setting materials in the bin. And so we have a Center for Sustainable Behavior and Impact that's really working to identify human-centered solutions to help reduce that intention action gap and to restore confidence in recycling, help advance equitable solutions, increase participation and capture, and decrease contamination, all of which are really critical to having a strong recycling system. And so I'm going to share a couple of examples from our work that show how changing the system or using some sort of intervention tactic can help increase recycling. And so just for the context of this, we're speaking about single family recycling, which I know varies a lot all over the US and even more so globally. But typically there's some sort of collection at residents' house. So for some people, it's just garbage collection and there's no recycling pickup. And that system obviously generates less recycling because recycling is really hard. So when someone has recycling or garbage service at their house, but then they have to go somewhere to a drop off, participation in recycling is quite low and few people participate and they don't bring very much material. Then when we see programs where residents can opt in to recycling, so they have garbage service and then they can add recycling service, that increases recycling, but still there's significant barriers. And so this is, we use this slide to really help communities understand that if you set up the system with behavior in mind and make recycling easier, you're going to collect more recyclables. So as recycling becomes easier and the default choice, residents recycle more materials. We find that on average, a US household generates about 750 to 800 pounds of recyclable material. And the better the system, the better, the more tons and pounds ultimately the system is going to be able to collect. And there's a really clear roadmap for how to get 400 of those, so roughly half of those pounds out of households. And that's by changing the system to making recycling more convenient at people's households. But then once we're at 400 pounds per household, there's not really a clear roadmap about how to get more of those pounds. And so that's really the work that we're embarking on to try to discover data-backed solutions that can help increase recycling so that we can get more of those materials out of landfills and back into the manufacturing system. So one example of a program that we have to reduce contamination is called our Feet on the Street program. And contamination in recycling is essentially garbage. So when garbage goes into the recycling, it makes it more difficult and costly to put these materials back into manufacturing. And sometimes it's because there's just too much garbage and it can't be sorted out, or other times it's because a bucket of paint, gets all over the recyclables and then they can't be made into something new. And so it's a really challenging issue for the recycling industry and something that is really critical to ensuring that recyclables make it to their next best use. So we developed a program to help reduce contamination, and we've tested this and deployed it across the country, and it works universally. Although the exact impact is different in different contexts, it's something that we can definitively say it works. And it consists of an informational mailing that tells people what's acceptable in the recycling and what's not, 4 rounds of feedback cart tagging. So that's where we have inspectors going ahead of the recycling truck, lifting the lid, looking at what's inside. And if there's contamination, so like a plastic bag or a bag of garbage, then they're leaving a feedback tag that's in a bright color, it says oops, and it lets the resident know what they did wrong. So for example, like there were plastic bags in your recycling. And then carts that are, after a warning, carts are not serviced. So the cart would not be emptied by the recycling truck on service day if contamination persists. And with this, we found that 4 rounds of tagging is really the sweet spot in terms of balancing cost and impact. We've done this with more rounds of cart tagging and find that it does continue to decrease contamination. So for example, with 5 or 6 tags, you continue to see the non-recyclables decrease. However, just weighing the cost to deploy, we really found 4 as the optimal balance to reduce contamination, but also to control costs. Another thing with this is we don't see a decrease in recycling with this. Many are concerned that if we give feedback, that people will quit recycling because they're concerned about doing it wrong or don't want to get another tag. But we actually find the opposite. We don't see that people drop out of recycling, and we actually see that more people are recycling more material, even though the campaign doesn't say recycle more. It's something about giving people this timely feedback and information that helps them recycle more. And so a really critical piece of this is that cart rejection. So with cart rejection, the container's not serviced, and so then people have less capacity to dispose of their materials the following week. So when people set things out at the curb, they want it to go away. Like that's the whole point. Your recycling or your garbage goes away and you don't have to deal with it anymore. So when it gets left, it creates an inconvenience for people, and it also really sends a strong signal. So we did a study in 2 neighboring communities in Massachusetts. These 2 communities are very similar, and they actually share a community recycling coordinator. And in one of the communities, New Bedford, we did education only. So we did the 4 rounds of tagging and an informational mailer. And then in the other community, Dartmouth, we did the same feedback with the 4 rounds of tagging and a mailer, but we also rejected carts. And we found that Dartmouth reduced contamination by nearly twice the rate of New Bedford. So it was twice as effective by combining the feedback and the cart rejection. We also did a follow-up study 1 year later and found that in Dartmouth, they had maintained the lower rate of contamination. So essentially the behavior stuck for an entire year. And in New Bedford, where it was information only, the impact had completely eroded within 1 year. And so for us, it really just solidifies the importance of that additional lever and using more than information only to change behavior. And lastly, I'll share one more example from a program that we did, a pilot program that we did in Cincinnati, Ohio, where we are looking at getting non-recyclers to start participating. So all these households had recycling carts, but some of them were not setting out recycling. And so we wanted to try to figure out what we could do to help these households start recycling. And so we took all the households that weren't recycling and we sent them a mailer that gave them the opportunity to request a free in-home recycling bin. And then we also sent 4 follow-up mailings. 2 were a recycling calendar, so a prompt or reminder to act and a reminder of when their collection day was. And then 2 motivational messages that used empathetic and logical messaging to try to motivate residents to recycle. And with this, we found that the households that were already recycling, so setting out their recycling either frequently or occasionally, started setting out their bin more. So these 4 mailers helped increase their recycling participation. However, the households that were not already recycling, the mailers alone essentially did nothing. There was a small increase in recycling, but it was comparable to the increase in the control group that received no interventions. And so, and then the households that opted in to receive a bin, some of these households started recycling, although not all of them started. And so I think, again, this solidifies that information alone can be a really effective tool, but the circumstance really matters. And for those that are already doing it, they're already engaged, they already have habits in place. So the information can help boost that participation. But for those needing to set up a new system, it was much less effective. We also did a focus group as a follow-up to this pilot and found that some people loved the in-home bins and some people didn't. And so, it's really just solidifies that like a one-size-fits-all tool doesn't really exist, as everyone has their own system in place in their homes. So some people said, like, I don't have room for that bin, that wouldn't work, while others were really excited to get it and felt like it made recycling really easy because it replaced an old taped up box they were using to collect recyclables, or they added a second bin to their home. So with non-recyclers, the bins can be an effective tool, although we still need to do more research to figure out how we can get people to really start that behavior. And with that, look forward to continuing to chat in the break rooms. Thanks again for having me.